Hello, we welcome you back to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast. Once again with your hosts Bernhard Günther and my wife Laura Matsu. And the topic of this episode is a very powerful and important one because it is about how to move from victimhood to empowerment. A very important topic, especially nowadays when many people are still stuck in what I call the victim blame trap. And especially nowadays in a world of really heightened conflict and increasing polarization. And we've seen it again, especially since the COVID pandemic over the 5 years, that this schism and tribalism between groups of people who are very identified with a certain ideology or political side have increased, right? From the left to the right, to the religious types, to the truth movement, anywhere. And you see a rising conflict and rupture within relationships, marriages, families, and friendships. I'm sure you've seen it in your own life as well. And again, we also seen it in parts of the truth or freedom movement in between truthers and what they call normies and sheeple. And if you really zoom out, you can see that the majority of humans, including those, many of who believe themselves maybe to be awake, are often trapped in an unconscious dynamic and feeding mechanism based on three specific roles that they identify with unconsciously for the most part and project on others. And these three roles are the victim, rescuer, and persecutor, also known as the drama triangle. So the topic of this episode is basically a deep dive into this drama triangle, what it means, how we can get stuck there, and most importantly, how we can get out of it, which is also the pathway to true change, also in the world, and towards higher levels of consciousness. I've referenced this drama triangle many times over the years in my articles, and we also work with it in our group programs. Now, the drama triangle was developed by Dr. Stephen Karpman in 1968. In a nutshell, it's basically a psychological and relational model that explains how people get unconsciously drawn into cycles of conflict, dysfunction, and emotional reactivity. It is a map of three roles that keep individuals stuck in victimhood, no matter where they start. So there's the victim, poor me, the rescuer who says poor you, and the persecutor, it's your fault, the blame. Karpman's insight was that these roles are not fixed identities. That's important to understand, but they are positions which people rotate through, sometimes even within minutes, in personal relationships, families, workplaces, and even within their own internal dialogue, right? And especially nowadays, now in the age of social media outrage-born political and ideological tribalism, with most people or many people operating from victim blame consciousness, understanding this dynamic of the drama triangle is key for anyone who really engages in inner work and wants to create a better world without falling into disempowering ways of seeing the world, which only contributes then to more friction and suffering, really. So in the first hour, we'll go over in depth over the three different roles we all tend to fall into and how this triangle works. We'll cover the psychological drivers for this drama triangle, why it's so sticky and hard to get out of it. And we'll also share our personal experiences and how each role shows up in culture and the bigger picture and what the pathway is to get out of this drama triangle. In the second hour, then we dive deeper into the solutions and ways to get out of it and how to transmute the victim, rescuer, and persecutor consciousness into a higher expression, as explained through what is called the empowerment triangle. We'll also provide guidance and tools for this process and explore the victim archetype, which is so prevalent specifically in our culture nowadays and how it shows up. Transforming the shadow victim into the enlightened victim is key work as well that will help empower you and others. And we also dive a bit deeper. We also look at this drama triangle from an esoteric occult perspective in light of the hyperdimensional matrix and how non-physical forces and entities benefit from us staying stuck in the drama triangle since they feed on the emotional luge we project on each other. So again, the second hour of the podcast is always available for members. If you're not a member yet, you can sign up at my website at veilofreality.com/membership. You have access to over 150 episodes, the second hours. And another little announcement, I'm going to start another round of my in-depth 10-week program, Mastering Spiritual Warfare, Discerning the Unseen Forces and the Path to Embodied Sovereignty, in October. But the enrollment will already start in September because it is limited to 40 people and by application only. You can go to masteringspiritualwarfare.com and sign up to the waiting list there to be notified when I start the enrollment process and give you the exact dates for when the course starts in October. But in this program, I dive deep into the reality of spiritual warfare, what it is, why it matters, and how unseen forces influence human behavior and world events. And it's definitely ramping up right now and over the next years. I dive deep into entity interferences and possession, how entities attach to people or influence us through trauma and unconscious patterns, how to differentiate between subpersonalities, entities, and also earthbound spirits, and the bigger picture of the role of evil in evolution and the occult teaching function as a catalyst for awakening. I'll also go deeper into psychic attacks and black magic, the different types of psychic attacks, and ties into spiritual discernment and inner guidance as well, understanding the difference between really true higher guidance versus deceptive influences, and tie this into shadow work and the process of purification, because it's necessary to face our own darkness and shadow as a prerequisite, so to speak, to spiritual awakening, and also as a protection from hostile forces. Ultimately, it's about understanding the hyperdimensional matrix and how hostile forces have manipulated humanity from behind the veil for thousands of years. And now we're in the end game with the role of AI and transhumanism as part of this matrix agenda. But we also will definitely turn to the light and how to work with divine forces, how to call in safely and align with benevolent powers for protection, healing, assistance, the role of sincere prayer, surrender, and divine will. And ultimately, I give you guys tons of practical tools for entity removal, energetic clearing, embodiment, protection, and all that ties into the splitting of humanity as well, which we're currently obviously experiencing, and the current choice point between soul integration and spiritual disintegration. And obviously this knowledge and everything is more urgent and relevant now than ever. So again, you can go to masteringspiritualwarfare.com and sign up to the waiting list, or the link is also listed in the show notes of this episode.
It's also all over your website, veilofreality.com as well. And if you're listening to this after October, you can always sign up to the waiting list, and then we use that waiting list to alert people whenever we're starting a new program, whether it's our regular Embodied Soul Awakening program or this one.
Exactly. Okay, let's go to the drama triangle, also called DDT, the dreaded drama triangle, right? So again, we're dealing with these three roles. The persecutor, right? That's where the problem dominates. The persecutor blames and wants to tear down and points the finger. It's your fault, right? The rescuer is the poor you, right? We pity others. We want to rescue others. The pain reliever and fears of not, the rescuer actually is afraid of not being needed. And the victim, that's the ultimate role, is the poor me, feels powerless, is lost, and, kind of wallowing in self-pity. Now, although all of them look different on the surface, and by the way, we go deeper into each role in this podcast, obviously, but all three roles, very interestingly, are rooted in shame, unmet childhood needs, and they stem from a lack of self-responsibility as well. And each role has what Cartman calls a starting gate position, meaning the one role you've learned first in your family of origin or through your childhood wounding or trauma, whatever it may be, where you start off, so to speak. But once you're on the triangle, be it either in the victim position, the rescuer position, or the persecutor position, you will inevitably rotate through all the other roles as well. This is very important to understand, right? So it's a closed system fueled by unmet needs, unconscious projection, and also unconscious beliefs. So a rescuer, for example, when you start there, can feel unappreciated and flips into victim, or a victim can retaliate and become a persecutor, or a persecutor may suddenly feel victimized, and round we go. And that happens all over, within families, within yourself, on the collective level. You will see it clearly once you understand this drama triangle. But everyone ends up in victim eventually. That is very important to understand. Even the rescuer, persecutor, because all roles are forms of disempowerment. This is important to understand. Again, it can happen externally or internally within yourself. You can play all the roles in your own head, cycling between self-criticism, self-pity, or self-soothing, for example. So there are various different psychological drivers for this drama triangle. Number one, obviously the family of origin programming, right? Childhood experiences teach you which roles you feel most natural or safe.
And just to add on to that, they're often very cleverly adaptive to the situation. So like you adapt to being these roles within your family of origin to help you survive certain situations. And then later on, they actually start obviously harming your life. So they're often adaptive and they often have an intelligence to them.
Right, exactly. Yeah, kind of following up on that, each role really reinforces painful core beliefs. You know, for example, I'm only valued for what I do to others. That's the rescuer, or the people pleaser as well. Ties into that, right? Or the persecutor, which has this narrative, people will hurt me if I don't control them, for example. And the victim, obviously the inner narrative, I can't survive without help. And it also works via projection, meaning we see in others what we can't accept in ourselves, right? So we can project these roles onto others. And there's a certain payoff as well, right? But the cost at the same time, because each role offers like a short-term emotional relief. That's why people get stuck in those roles, but it reinforces really long-term dysfunctions for reasons that become obvious.
Yeah, they have also secondary gains in psychological terms where we gain something out of being the chronic victim or being the persecutor. So the reason why we stay stuck in those patterns is because there's something that we gain out of it.
Exactly. There are certain unconscious payoffs, conscious or unconscious payoffs, regardless what role you fall into, persecutor, rescuer, victim. Can be just for attention, validation, control, moral high ground, holier than thou, virtue signaling, grandiosity, or entitlement. And then, as Laura just mentioned, alluded to, there's cultural reinforcement as well. Because many families or even workplaces, political sites, obviously media narratives normalize these dynamics. Again, it's pathology normalized. And the ego is very easily identified with these roles, right? It becomes part of your identity. I'm the strong one. I'm the victim of injustice, right? The victim Olympics, as we call it. I'm the helper. I'm the rescuer, and the ego feeds of that. And it pendulums really between grandiosity of feeling better than or self-diminishment, feeling less than. That ties into that as well. And obviously there's hidden cost, an obvious cost of staying on the triangle. There's a loss of intimacy and trust, perpetuation of dependency and disempowerment, all kinds of emotional exhaustion and burnout, reinforcement of unconscious, painful core beliefs, and chronic continuing conflict and resentment. So ultimately, the drama triangle is a map of the unconscious ego story, so to speak, and recognizing it and exiting it is key for ultimate emotional maturity to become a true adult, so to speak. Healthy boundaries, authentic intimacy, self-responsibility, and also creative self-actualization.
Okay, so first we're going to spend some time covering the victim archetype. And just to be clear, because this is a really common misunderstanding about the victim archetype, is that identifying with the victim doesn't mean that you're not allowed to share or acknowledge terrible things that have happened to you, painful experiences. We're not talking about blaming you for the abuse you experienced. It has nothing to do with that. The victim is more taking on the victim as a consistent identity. And so the victim role is really rooted in this putting yourself down position, where you're driven by shame, your own childhood conditioning. It's the really wounded part of the inner child, the part who is naturally vulnerable, the part who did get really hurt and who may need occasional support, but that was also learned to see themselves as permanently powerless or defective or incapable of making changes in their life. So this is different from just occasionally, and we are all interdependent on the other people in times of need. We don't live in this completely individualistic society, although people like to tell you we do. It's this chronic learned helplessness where you need someone to take care of you as if they're a parent taking care of you as a child, basically, while simultaneously, ironically, resenting them for helping you. So the roots of this are things that happen in early childhood where we were either raised by very overprotective or rescuing caregivers who deprived us of the chance to develop self-reliance. So parents who overparent, who overdo things for us. And this can happen even subtle ways, like if a child is struggling to, even tie their shoes, for example, like the parent just rushes in and does it for them. You want to allow the kid to go through their own struggles and process to be able to do things for themselves. And then through these early experiences, we can create an identity of incompetence. And I also just want to add too, this can be rooted in truly having victimizing experiences happening to you and almost being sucked into a black hole about it, where I'm always going to be abused. I'm always going to be this shame-based person. I'm always going to be all of these negative beliefs that you've picked up from yourself from the way that your parents have treated you. So we create this identity from the repeated messages that we get. They can be either implicit, meaning just more subtle, or explicit, meaning things we were actually told about we can't handle life. And then that becomes a core part of that self-image. And then the victim takes on shame as an identity. They internalize the belief that they're intrinsically flawed or damaged. Or a really big core belief is the victim is something is wrong with me. And a lot of this can happen even in also more subtle ways where you were just heavily criticized as a child and then you learn to just constantly put yourself down, or you learn that something is inherently defective within you if you weren't loved by your parents. So there's a myriad of ways that this can show up, and you can adapt this victim stance from actual victimizing experiences to being overparented, to being put down, or just being treated like you were a child your whole life and not being allowed to go through the regular stages of development. There's an emotional payoff to this too, because the victim gets to avoid responsibility for their actions, for their life. They tend to avoid any risks, and they tend to outsource their decisions and care to others. So instead of taking action on the things in their lives and what they need to do, you might see a victim like asking someone else, sometimes someone else who doesn't even know like even what they're talking about, or doesn't even have an expertise in what they're talking about, for solutions, and, feeling helpless to make change in their lives. So some of the core beliefs of the victim could be, I can't do it. I'm broken. I'm unfixable. Something is wrong with me. As I said before, a really common one. Others have to take care of me. Why try? I always fail. They're really self-diminishing, self-defeating core beliefs. And some of the traits the victim might have is they have this air of fragility, like no one is allowed to trigger me. If you trigger the victim, you become the persecutor. Even if you say something that wasn't meant to be hurtful to someone who identifies as a victim, they can just lash out at you anyway. And so being around people who are identify with being a victim can feel like you're walking on eggshells because you constantly don't want to upset them. And you could say the most innocuous thing and you could actually upset them. And they also have this air of not feeling competent with themselves. Sometimes they can be constantly confused about life. They tend to even deny themselves the ability to solve a problem in their lives. When they're dealing with a difficulty in their lives, they avoid taking independent action on it. These are often people who like almost overly go to other people for advice, but they do it as a way of avoiding taking action themselves, but then they actually won't take their advice at all anyway. And then they're the kind of people who they'll ask you the same thing over and over again. You give them advice and they never do anything because it's not actually about them taking action. They just want to outsource responsibility to someone else. And there also is an ongoing sense of learned helplessness, which is basically a psychological state that develops when someone, after repeated experiences of either being harmed or controlled or ignored, they've come to believe that I'm powerless to change my situation, even when opportunities for change or escape exist. And then they become hyper dependent on others to help them with tasks that at their level of development or age, they should be able to do out of their own agency. So you really see that there's this eternal, almost arrested development where they're not taking on this adult role in their life. Often they can also engage in self-destructive behaviors, which is really common for if you have a shame-based personality, like substance abuse, binge eating. I would also say that a lot of toxic relationships with abusive people can be part of this victim pattern where they constantly get in relationships with the same types of people. They always tend to turn out the same way, and then they always say, "Oh, he was a narcissist," but they keep getting themselves into the situation without taking responsibility. And they also tend to resent those who try to help them because it highlights their perceived inadequacy. So at the same time they're becoming over-dependent on advice, when someone tries to actually help them, they also tend to lash out. So you're kind of in a lose-lose situation when you try and, like, I would say even rescue or help a victim, because they're not going to take your advice anyway, and sometimes they'll just lash out at you. And they're really skilled at passive-aggressive sabotage. So you might offer them ideas about like how you're going to, what they could do to change. They'd be like, "Yes, but I'm the exception to this," or "Yes, but this is what's going on in the world." And they'll always have someone else to blame or some excuse why they can't do something. And yeah, there's a lot of hidden payoffs, or in psychological terms, they call these secondary gains. They get to, most of all, gain attention, care, and support from others. So the wounded inner child is trapped in the state of dependency where they constantly have a parent-child dynamic going on in their relationships, where they learn, the more I spiral, the more I pretend like I'm helpless, the more people take care of me in this, probably the way that my mother and father didn't. They also maintain this familiar identity rooted in dependency. They also avoid the discomfort that comes with making changes in your life, taking risks, potentially even failing. They get to stay stuck in the same place. And they most of all avoid responsibility for the choices they've made and the outcomes that have happened in their life, because it's always going to be someone else's fault. And this really does lead to a feeling of chronic disempowerment, lack of agency, which is really huge. Agency is this ability to feel like you can direct your life, lead your own life by taking constructive action. Victims are very low agency people, where they feel like they're just at the mercy of forces outside of themselves, including what they don't realize is their own unconscious self-sabotage. They also depend on rescuers who they may eventually resent, or if the rescuer isn't always there, they're going to blame them for abandoning them. And then also turn the rescuer into a persecutor, because as we said, the roles will switch around a lot. And then this just will reinforce their negative self-image. Like, everyone abandons me. I'm worthless. I can't do anything. And they tend to have a very limited sense of self-confidence in themselves. And they also repeatedly attract either persecutors, controlling people in relationships, or rescuing people in relationships. And I'm going to give an example later on in this podcast about how that can show up in your own life and relationships based on my experience. So there's really a downward spiral that begins with someone who starts out as a victim will then turn into a persecutor. So either, like, basically they'll start as a victim and then they'll turn into the persecutor because they'll start really blaming and being aggressive or passive aggressive towards other people to punish them for not rescuing them, basically, or not helping them. And then the victim can also turn into the rescuer, where they kind of manipulate others into dependency. You're the only one who can help me. Or sometimes I also notice that victims will take on an identity of being rescuers to, like, whole groups of oppressed groups. And they'll they'll identify with the victimized, quote unquote, oppressed group. And, like, I'm going to rescue all the people in this, like, war-torn region. And, like, they take on this almost like savior complex, but it really comes with identifying with their own victimhood and also identifying with the victimhood of others. And then they ultimately turn back to victim. So the victim is really huge in culture. And, you know, the victim is not that they're isn't real suffering that we experience. It's about identifying with being powerless and making it a primary part of your identity and not moving on from that identity or experience. And in modern culture, especially, by the way, Neptune and Pisces has been such a period where we've really worshipped the victim, we've worshipped the oppressed, we've worshipped the minority, and then you could see it kind of reach the it reached the pinnacle as we ended Neptune and Pisces, which was just actually last year, by the way, where we had this whole kind of BLM woke culture, which was all about uplifting the oppressed minorities. It was all about worshiping the victim, basically. So this is a huge cultural narrative. I think it's going to shift, but it's still going to be an ongoing thing because it is an archetype in the collective consciousness. And you see this in culture where, you know, even in current times, it's like the Matrix is after me, or like I'm being targeted, you know, and there's almost these constant victim narratives, or, you know, even in marketing, you know, brands can be like, we're struggling against the bad guys. Or in therapy culture, this is really huge. I think this is the most predominant way of victimhood that kind of lives on. There's an overemphasis on trauma as an identity and a permanent label rather than something that can be overcome and healed. And, you know, you don't want to go, and I really want to make a note because there's so much nuance here where then people go to the other side and they turn into the persecutor and they're like, no one is ever traumatized unless you've been in a war or experienced these big T traumas, you know, like having an abusive family isn't really trauma. We all get hit, blah, blah, blah. You have this other side where they have the persecutor versus the victim, right? Which is also not helpful. But I want to point out that even Bessel van der Kolk really warned that there is dangers making trauma your identity and a permanent label because it can keep you stuck and help and prevent you from actually healing that trauma. And so politically, you also see this on the left. You have political figures that frame entire groups of people as permanently oppressed, incapable of, you know, helping their own lives without constant government intervention. So this is a lot of these woke DEI ideologies that hire based on how many boxes you check of an oppressed group. And then also you see the right who frame this like kind of woke takeover as like we're losing our country and save the white race, and they use their grievances to kind of push back against the other side. So they both have their own faces of victimhood, basically. And then most of all, we really saw this with the online social justice movement, where there's this belief that if you're part of an oppressed group or you're part of a minority group, you automatically have superior moral authority and status, regardless of how you act. AKA like white men need to shut up and listen to the trans Muslim disabled person of color. Like this, they call it the oppression Olympics. Like the more oppressed boxes you have, the more power you get. And then white people need to shut up and sit down and become allies. And it becomes this whole, you know, the victim, the oppressed person who may have actually experienced victimizing experience, then becomes a persecutor back. So you see this just vicious cycle with it. And then you can also see this in the conspiracy echo chambers where people are like, we're all victims of a hidden cabal, and like, you know, there's nothing we can do to change anything, and they reinforce this helplessness and nihilism unless someone who they probably wouldn't accept their help anyway because they would be too paranoid to even think that they would be useful will rescue them. So you see this all over the place, and it's really reached a pinnacle, especially in these times.
Yeah, a lot of people in the so-called truth movement, especially black pill type, definitely are in this victim archetype and definitely embedded in the drama triangle. So let's go to the next role, the rescuer. And by the way, we'll dive deeper more into the victim archetype also in the second hour in a more nuanced way, because there are very subtle expressions or archetypal patterns of the victim where we can easily fall into without knowing it. So it's important to become aware of that. So the rescuer is basically the habitual helper, right? Role on the drama triangle. And that's a tricky one because the rescuer is the noble one, the good one. Like we all want to save the fair maiden, right? The hero in Hollywood movies and all of that, right? So when you notice a rescuer, you may think they seem very generous, selfless, and caring and all of that. But beneath the surface of the rescuer and the drama triangle, their behavior is actually driven by codependency and unmet childhood needs and a hidden fear of abandonment. So actually, instead of genuinely empowering others, the rescuer actually overfunctions, meaning he or she's doing for others what they could and should be doing for themselves first and foremost. Can definitely relate to that. So it creates a certain dependency and reinforces actually the victim role in others, right? And it keeps the rescuer trapped in victimhood too. And there are various psychological roots for the perpetual rescuer as well, right? That ties into early neglect of personal needs. Most rescuers grew up in families where their own emotional needs were ignored, minimized, or dismissed, right? So it's a role they learned in childhood because in order to get the love or safety you needed, you took on the caretaker role, learning that you could only connect with others by meeting others' needs and without expressing your own. And then parents who are not really actualized or have not really worked on meeting their own needs can inadvertently try to get their needs met through the child, which is not the child's role, and then kind of feed or create that rescuer role in the child, right? That's kind of emotional enmeshment. Then there's internalized neglect. As adults, then rescuers unconsciously treat themselves with the same lack of care they received in childhood, right? Ties into narcissistic wounding as well. And then it's kind of the shadow aspect of the mother principle, right? So the nurturing instinct is present, but it's very distorted, right? It becomes controlling, even smothering, or even manipulative. It also isn't ultimately helping the victim at all, but keeps them dependent, right? Like the classic devouring mother archetype. So for the rescuer, it's important that the victim stays a victim. It's not really about helping the victim to move on. And you can see this in relationships as well. A lot of common relationship patterns, both male and female, is like the victim-savior relationship, right? Especially for the man. Like in my past relationships, that was one of my roles. I was the rescuer, the shining white knight in his armor, trying to save the damsel in distress. So this devouring mother archetype is very important to understand. In Jungian terms, the devouring mother is the overprotective, engulfing maternal figure. She really smothers her children and prevents them actually from developing their own autonomy by over-nurturing, controlling, or keeping them infantilized. This also relates to the shadow of the left, the political left, and excessive force on safe spaces and trigger warnings, and nobody should get triggered, nobody's emotions should get upset, right? No one is ever allowed to say anything that could even be seen as a moderately upsetting or even offensive.
A big term too is microaggressions, by the way.
Exactly. So that's a key one. Like, yeah, you can kind of
You can't even look at someone in a way that
Exactly.
could potentially be perceived as negative.
Yeah, the woke leftist agenda is really representing the devouring mother archetype, so to speak. So what are the core beliefs of that rescuer? Number one is my needs don't matter, right? I am only valuable if I'm needed. There's a certain self-importance that comes in. If you need me, you won't leave me, right? So that's this dependency. Or if I take care of them long enough, they will take care of me someday, which is really magical thinking, assuming something will happen just because you believe in it, even though it defies the grounded logic of the situation. And you have like all these assumptions. And there's also, you're not really acting with pure intention, without expectation. So the rescue on the drama triangle has almost a hidden agenda, a hidden entitlement, and certain expectations on unconscious levels mostly. So there are various behavioral traits of the rescuer. One of them is enabling, and meaning it solves problems for others instead of them letting them face natural consequences, right? It's always trying to rescue and save without really empowering basically the quote-unquote victim to learn themselves.
Yeah, they can really, you see this in classic like drug addiction, codependent relationships where the drug addict is this chronic victim always asking to be bailed out, and then the rescuer always bails them out without actually sometimes making them fall on their ass and deal with that rock bottom.
Yeah. This ties into overprotection, steps in too soon, or shields others from any sense of discomfort or challenge, which could help them grow, right? Goes back to the leftist, right? Control disguised as help, meaning directs or fixes or manages situations without being asked, right? This is a big one for a rescuer, that a rescuer tries to help another person even if the person is not asking for it. The the rescuer ignores his own or her own personal boundaries, needs, and even health in the process. And the rescuer also seeks validation, gaining identity and self-worth through being indispensable. That's where the ego hijacks this. Oh, I'm a good person because I'm helping or rescuing others, right? Also ties into martyrdom, when unappreciated. Also can shift to the victim role with resentment. After all I've done for you, right? When you hear that, I've heard that a lot. I also rescue role is apparent.
Also add something I've seen. So the rescuer, really big in the Palestine movement, but then it turned into the persecutor, where the rescuer is like, I'm speaking up for Palestine, and going mobbing and attacking others who weren't speaking up enough in their view. So the rescuer, that's a good example, the rescuer turning into the persecutor.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So there are payoffs for the rescuer as well, right? Most rescuers avoid facing their own problems by focusing on others. I've done the same in my days of quote-unquote activist, even pro-Palestine activist. I used activism to avoid what I needed to face within myself and get a sense of an identity and self-importance out of it by standing up for the quote-unquote victim. Yeah. And that ties into the next payoff, gaining a sense of importance and identity through being the one who helps and fixes others, right? But still controls the relationship through fostering dependency. And it also, through the rescuing, it reduces the fear of abandonment or making themselves indispensable, so to speak, right? But as Laura just alluded to, and, the rescuer can also then morph into other roles on the drama triangle. Right? First, they rescue, which means the rescuer takes over, solving other people's problems or shielding them from consequences. Then the dependency grows, which means the victim becomes less self-reliant, confirming the rescuer's beliefs they are indispensable. And then resentment builds. The rescuer feels unappreciated, overworked, or even betrayed. And then the roles shift. Then the rescuer moves into victim. No one appreciates me. Or into the persecutor. After all I've done for you, how dare you, right? And then return back to the rescuer. Guilt or fear of abandonment drives them basically back into helping again, over and over again, and the cycle repeats. So the shadow rescuer really needs others to remain dependent on them. And they often enable dysfunction in the relationships under the guise of help. And you see this definitely in culture, right? As you mentioned before, the overprotective helicopter parenting, as it's called, right? That is a style of parenting of over-involved parents, where parents closely hovers over the child's life, monitoring, controlling, intervening excessively in the activities, decisions, and problems. I think that's even more heightened with giving the kids iPhones and smartphones and text me and, stay in contact all the time and all of this. Really shielding children from all discomfort and preventing resilience.
Ironically, too, it is behind a lot of the tech addiction, because the reason that parents allow their kids unfettered access to phones, iPads, devices is because they're scared of what would happen when they just play outside on their own, which obviously a lot of us grew up doing. But then ironically, they open their child up to all sorts of dangers through the tech addiction.
Yeah. Then you have it again, obviously, in the woke DEI programs, right? These programs unintentionally, or sometimes intentionally, I would say, reinforce the belief that minorities can't succeed through their merit alone and need ongoing special treatment and safe spaces where they're segregated from others, right? You sort of reinforce the victim. This is the irony of it all, right? Of this whole woke DI program, you reinforce the victim state by pretending to be the rescuer. And obviously in politics, the expansion, saving people from economic hardship, right? Justifying more government. So the government becomes the rescuer, right? But that entraps people then even more, making them more dependent. Socialism, communism, the ultimate rescue, right? The daddy or mommy government will pay for everything and take care of everyone. Or the framing military intervention as liberating people, the rescuers, right? While kind of creating new ideology systems and creating really chaos and long-term instability, as we've seen with any war over the decades. Then you have white saviorism, These are individuals or groups who insert themselves as the saviors for who they deem to be oppressed groups, while virtue signaling how superior they are because they are allies to the oppressed group. And then the activist rescue addiction, meaning groups whose identity completely rely on having a constant crisis to solve. So they unconsciously keep finding them or recreating them because the rescuers trapped in the drama triangle are actually not interested in truly empowering the quote-unquote victim or helping them moving on. Their role depend of victims staying victims.
So as you can see, since we do live in this culture where there's a surgence, I would even call it a worship of victimhood, you also have the corresponding rescuer also there, just as strong. And then we are going to move into the persecutor as well. So, I've heard a lot of people talk about how we live in this age of the victim, we're worshiping the victim, but we live in the age of the whole drama triangle. Wherever you find a victim, you're going to find a rescuer and you're going to find a persecutor. The victim can't exist alone. It has to exist in the whole system. So lastly, we're going to talk about the persecutor, which is the most overtly aggressive role on the drama triangle. And like the other roles, it's also rooted in shame, fear, childhood conditioning, because beneath the tough, even mean and aggressive exterior of the persecutor is also someone who often grew up in an environment that was unsafe. Maybe it was also abused themselves, and they learned to equate vulnerability with danger. So they developed a more hardened, aggressive, and controlling way of adapting to the world as a form of self-protection. So it's, again, this adaptive mechanism. So either someone abused them or they learn to become controlling to prevent abuse from happening to them again. So persecutors survive by overpowering others. So this is either they can be physically, these are people who are actually physically quite abusive to people. They can be emotionally abusive, psychologically abusive. They can be psychologically manipulative, because I feel like men who are more persecutors are more physically overpowering, whereas women lean into the more emotionally, psychologically abusive side of it. Not always the case. Obviously, there's overlap, but you're less likely to see a woman who's physically abusive, but you will see a woman who can be highly psychologically abusive. And this is to avoid feeling powerless themselves. So it's rooted in childhood abuse or neglect. Persecutors are often raised in environments where some kind of abuse, whether emotional or physical, was quite common. There was usually quite a lot of hostility in the childhood home. One parent maybe was an alcoholic and abusive, and the other parent was a victim. So they saw the persecutor victim happen in their own family of origin. And then in psychological terms, what they do is they identify with the aggressor. So to avoid being weak or even being abused, they emulate the parent who had the most power and who most likely was the one who was abusing them or others. And they also have to repress their vulnerability, because in environments like that, it's not safe to be vulnerable. You're going to just get beat up or put down. So they have to push down their inadequacy, push down their fear, push down their vulnerable feelings, and then create this facade, this tough persona on the external. And it also represents the shadow father principle, where instead of the healthy father, which would be guiding and protecting the family, they learn to control, to dominate, to punish others. And some of the beliefs a persecutor often has is that the world is dangerous. Only if I'm ruthless and aggressive, I'll survive. If I'm not in control, I'm going to be hurt. If I want to be powerful, I must never show weakness. Persecutors often get very disturbed and angry at other people showing weakness, because they show them what they are unwilling to accept in themselves. So that's why the persecutor tends to have a very toxic relationship with people who are victimized, because they don't like anyone being weak. And they also believe that if others deserve all the aggression that they're unleashing at them, they believe that they deserve it, that this is justified. So, yeah, and some of the traits that the persecutor might have is, number one, they tend to see disagreement as a threat. They tend to want to control people to the maximum degree. So here you have people who might rank high on the spectrum of narcissism. They have to control everyone around them. If the person doesn't do what they say, they lash out at them. They use this covert kind of lashing out and anger to control other people around them. They tend to not only bully people, they'll shame people, they'll threaten them, they'll lecture them. They can be very interrogative. They also, if someone they believe has like done something wrong to them, even if it's perceived, because I've even seen people of this types like think that like, oh, that person's like disrespecting me. And it will just be something subtle the person did. And it's all in their head because they have this very fragile ego. But even if they perceive that someone isn't treating them in the way that they think they should be treated, they'll be like, I can't let them get away with it. And they can be really explosive over very minor things that sometimes aren't even the person actually trying to upset them. And they really see themselves as a victim. So they justify their aggression because they think that they're just defending themselves. They think it's necessary. And if they see vulnerable in others, they tend to attack it as well. So these are the kinds of people who, if they were dealing with someone who has actually gone through experience that was really victimizing, they're just going to lash out at them and be like, it's your fault. Why did you get yourself into this? Because their vulnerability is actually really uncomfortable for them to see.
It reminds you of authoritarian parenting as well, right?
Yeah,
all of this.
For sure. Yeah. And they tend to be hyper-vigilant in their lives and their relationships especially. They're always scanning for potential threats where they often see threats where there is none. They'll create them for themselves. Like they really live in this state where they're constantly looking for things to attack the other person in regards to. And the payoff for them is they do get to maintain a sense of power and control. They avoid feeling weak. They avoid feeling dependent on others. They avoid feeling lesser than or inadequate. They also tend to use anger as a stimulant to counter the real shame and depression, which is under the surface. This also keeps others at a safe emotional distance where they'll never have to be vulnerable with another person in any way whatsoever. And so the person who starts out as the persecutor will sometimes switch into the rescuer. Like, you know, I just criticized you and I just lashed out at you because I care about you. I was trying to help you. Or they'll turn into the victim. You'll see this too, especially with you have like more aggressive narcissistic types. Will they be like, they did it to me and I'm the real victim here, even though they were the one who lashed out at the person. And then they go back to persecutor again. You know, they often are convinced that they're innocent. They also reinforce the way that they tend to be really aggressive and attacking towards others. They deserved it. You know, I needed to defend myself, etc. So it's really about control. It's about domination. It's about punishing others. And they often reframe it as necessary for justice, for safety. And it just reaffirms their belief of the world that you need to control other people in order to feel safe. So one of the biggest examples and ways that we see this in today's culture is this cancel culture. So this is really the persecutor who decides that they need to shame others, dox others, they need to mob others, publicly attack them, and they frame it as accountability. Like, we're just doing this to hold you accountable, right? But they're, you know, they execute these mobbings and these public shamings without any empathy whatsoever, often disproportionately, often to completely imagined circumstances, by the way. And remember these like microaggressions, like you say the even most subtle politically incorrect thing, and then you could just be mobbed by a group of people and without any due process. So it's really like this mob rule instead of actually allowing someone to even articulate their own feelings about it or defend themselves. And so you see this also politically, where you have to make people comply to certain ideologies through speech codes in the name of protecting marginalized groups. For example, making it a federal crime to misgender someone. You can also pass laws aimed at restricting behavior of certain groups, framed as protecting, making people more secure, protecting values. So you could see this in restricting what books can be read, what media can be shared, what words can be spoken in order to protect the public. So we actually saw a lot of this happening during COVID, where you weren't allowed to even question the official narrative. You would be censored, and they framed it under public safety. They deleted people's accounts. They threw them off of social media. And then you also see this in mass movements like extremist activism, where you see either environmental, religious, or ideological groups that justify intimidation or destruction as necessary to stop a greater evil, along with this online mob justice, where there's these coordinated attacks on individuals who don't think the way that you think, believing that shaming, doxing, canceling them will teach them a lesson. So you can really see this everywhere, especially in culture, because if we live in the age of the victim, we also live in the age of the rescuer and the persecutor. And these roles are interchangeable. We switch between them all the time. And, you know, we're never just one of them. There's always a shifting within the roles.
Yeah, so that was a very good deep dive into these 3 different roles. I'm sure we can all fall into them, right? It's also important not to see how this plays out in others or in culture, but specifically how easily you can fall into any of these roles. You know, it's really to be honest with yourself. And later on, we definitely show you no more than how to get out of the drama triangle into the empowerment triangle, right? That's the really key point.
And I'm going to end with a personal story because I've really gone through this experience myself, which I've touched on in other podcasts where we've talked about woke ideology. And, you know, and it's funny because I'm like very much in the middle now in many ways. I'm trying to hold the tension between the left and the right because I see the victimhood on both sides. I see the rescuers on both sides. I see the persecutors on both sides. But I really identified with a lot of ideologies that were centered around me being an oppressed victim. And I realized that one of the major shifts that I had to do in my own healing was actually exit the drama triangle. So to begin with context, I grew up in a town that is actually quite well known for its racism. I'm not going to say the town here. It's easy to find out, but there's tons of like documentaries and things said about how it's like a huge racist town. It's a really small working class town in Northern Ontario. Predominantly, at least back then when I grew up, it was made up of European Christian settlers who one half of my family were some of the early settlers to that areas from Europe. And it also had a large indigenous population. So for those who don't know my own racial background, I'm half Asian, which is something that was way less common back then than it is now. And I also grew up around Hinduism as a spiritual framework. So my brothers had classical Indian names. So in many ways, me and my brothers stood out in this small town as outliers. The kids our age could tell that we weren't exactly like them. And I remember growing up and hearing, it was quite normal to hear people call Indigenous people all sorts of derogatory names, which I won't repeat here. But I saw firsthand how this whole group of people were treated as less than, and many of them lived really difficult lives of poverty, abuse, substance abuse, which is also something I experienced on my Japanese side of the family as well, because they lost their home and business after World War II, and they were thrown in the internment camps. So the Japanese side of my family were in a victimizing experience because of what happened in World War II and what they experienced from the government of Canada. So one of my first direct experiences of what I would call more extreme racism, meaning like there was always a background racism I experienced in that town, happened when I was about 7 or 8, and I was playing marbles with an older girl. She was maybe about 12, like a few years older than me, and when she lost marbles, she became super furious, and she basically pushed me to the ground and just started kicking me in the stomach repeatedly while she yelled racist slurs at me, and somehow my mom just happened to be nearby, and she stepped in to stop her. And then later on in high school, which is a few years later, I was called all sorts of racist names in the hallways by other kids, including a guy who actually ended up having a crush on me, by the way. So there was people who were like persecuting me, but they were doing it out of their own like defense mechanism. It was really just hard to kind of navigate at the time because they pretended like they hated me, but they were doing it because they liked me, like all sorts of just psychological dynamics I didn't understand at the time. And I basically adapted myself by finding kids to bully myself. So in order to not be victimized, I became the aggressor. I even tried to fit in with the more popular kids for a brief period, thinking that they would protect me. But then again, later I moved to a different city, I switched schools, and I was in a school which was predominantly Black people. And again, I was the outsider, and I got bullied again for absolutely no reason. And I felt like I was the victim again. So I constantly kind of shifted between this victim, persecutor, back to the victim. And I was definitely put into some difficult experiences. I won't deny this. But let's just flash forward to my early 20s. That's when I started getting into what would later be known as woke ideology. So for me, it really showed up as first just hating white men. And if someone sent me a lecture by a white guy, for example, I'd be like, well, what do I have to learn from another white man? And I was surrounded by also peers who were exploring feminism, blaming the patriarchy, especially white men. And it became an easy outlet for our own kind of like young adulthood aggression. And it gave me a way to channel not only my early experiences of racism, but also all the negative experience I've had with men being objectified, harassed, even sexually abused. So I was really identified with victimhood, and I also constantly sought rescuers. But this often left me dependent on others. It put me in really dangerous situations as well, because any rescuer who would come to my rescue would also eventually become the persecutor, because they had their own hidden agenda for rescuing me, which would often suit their own personal needs. But if I didn't meet those needs, they would lash out. So I was just constantly, as long as I was stuck in the victim, I was constantly attracting other persecutors and rescuers. And I really held on to this way of seeing this world for a good part of my 20s until my Saturn return, which happened around 28. And at that time, I was also recovering from years of trauma and drug addiction. And honestly, at this point, I was so dissociated. My ego had gotten so blown out from all the trauma, from the addiction, that something just inside of my persona broke, where I realized that in order to heal, I had to just let go of that old persona, that old self. And there was this major shift that happened to me where I decided that if I wanted to heal, I had to take total self-responsibility. I couldn't blame others. I couldn't blame the system. I couldn't blame anyone who had done anything to me, because bad things had happened and I was deeply traumatized, but I needed to do what I could to heal myself in mind, body, and spirit in order to move forward. So this is when I started all sorts of healing. Most of all, I stopped blaming men, the world, and I started making active choices to change my life. And then later, I recognized that also I had very negative perceptions of men that were deeply damaging in my relationships with them, which I see actually now in this rise of this feminism now, where I just see really hateful things being said about men all the time, especially by people who are more leaning left. And I had placed men into this category of persecutor while I played the victim. But then again, I had positive friendships with men that showed me that not all men would treat women the same way that I had been treated. And I really began to just own my life, do what I could to change it, examine and question everything I had believed up until then, which I think is really important, questioning every single thing you believe. And I want to also make a note that this didn't mean that I was denying the reality of harmful people, which also would have been naive and a spiritual bypass, but it was transforming my own inner persecutor. So instead of projecting hate onto all men, I learned to just set boundaries with men clearly and assertively without aggression. You know, there is harmful people out there and you need to learn how to say no. You need to be able to walk away from those people. But most importantly, I really stopped waiting for anyone to rescue me. Even some of the therapists that I worked with at this time were really crucial to my own development, because they didn't try and fix my suffering. They simply sat with me with it, and they helped me take responsibility for my choices, especially bad choices that I was making in relationships so I could stop repeating destructive patterns. And I really saw the direct effects in my life that as long as I identified as a victim, I attract rescuers who often turn into persecutors, that I couldn't truly change or heal because I was dependent on an outside source to help me. And it was only when I took full self-responsibility and found people who would empower me rather than rescue me, did I experience profound change. And I just want to put on also another important note, because there's an important nuance here as well I want to highlight, because I see these days, there's this there's this rise of this toxic feminism happening on the left, and then there's this rise of anti-feminism happening on the right. And ironically, someone like Candace Owens, for example, who's very outspoken about feminism, is actually living a life that feminism provided her. She has her own podcast. She makes a lot of money. She's really successful in the world. And I want to point out that feminism, because that's what I was really attached to, it does have a very dark shadow side. But falling into black and white thinking about it is also naive, because and that's what I did for a period too, is I kind of turned against the old self and then almost become a persecutor to the old mindset, because, the feminism is why I could even make choices to change my life. I wasn't dependent on a man to help me. I could get a job, etc. At the same time, you see that feminism has become very toxic because it's collapsed into this hatred of all men, which I see a lot of these days, which mirrors a lot of what I experienced. So on my own journey, I've really learned the importance of holding this tension between opposites. So if you simply flip roles and go to the other side of the extreme, we become persecutors ourselves. So maybe at first we're more left-leaning, more feminist-leaning, but then we can easily turn into the persecutor, hating feminists, hating women, hating the left, because we see the shadow side, and we get caught in this victim, persecutor, rescuer dance in the same cycle. And that's how this whole red pill or anti-woman rhetoric arises and insists women should only be mothers or shouldn't vote. So I want to touch on this kind of cultural moment that we're at, because yes, we are seeing a rise of a toxic form of feminism, but then ironically, the red-pilled right and the toxic feminists are both showing the same trait, which in Jungian terms is being animus possessed. So they're demonstrating very rigid ways of thinking, of seeing the world. They over-identify with their opinions. They become domineering, argumentative, judgmental. It's very stuck in their head. And this is basically also they turn into persecutors against each other, and they're cut off from the receptivity and the feeling nature of the feminine. So we have the devouring mother, and then we have the abusive father in this kind of shadow dance politically right now. And I think really that one of the deepest healings would be working on animus integration for women, which is coming into relationship with the empowered feminine rather than the distorted form, either the tyrannical, controlling, or overprotective form. So this animus possession turns women from victims, persecutors, keeps them in the drama triangle. And it's really about not falling into any of these roles, victim, persecutor, rescuer, so we can step out of these disempowering cycles that are draining our lives and really create real change in our lives. And most of what I've learned is that true empowerment won't come from blaming someone, whether it's blaming the right, the left, the elite, men, women, blaming the patriarchy. It comes from stepping out of that system entirely. So we can recognize things that we don't like in this world, but we don't need to project it outwards. We don't need to wait for someone to rescue us. We don't need to wait for some magic pill or politician to change everything. Instead, stepping into the empowerment triangle, which we're going to get into the second hour, is becoming active creators in our lives who can choose how we respond to life, who can coach ourselves into overcoming our wounds rather than being identified with them, and challenge ourselves to take action that aligns with our soul purpose and aligns with the reason that we're here to the path that we're here to do.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story. It was a great example how we all can easily fall into all these roles, especially when you then knee-jerk into reject one shadow aspect. That was really profound the way you share, because that's happening a lot. You see the same with the New Age to Christian pipeline, right? And then, they see in all forms within the social classes, so to speak, where these archetypes are played out, these roles of the drama triangle. So now with that being said, as Laura alluded to, we need to step up and exit the drama triangle. So that is what we will explore in the second hour in depth, right? We dive deeper into the solutions and how to get out of the drama triangle, right? The victim becomes actually the creator. The rescuer becomes the coach. The persecutor becomes the challenger in a more conscious way, without the shadow projections, without the blame, without any of that. And that really also elevates levels of consciousness. So we show you guys how to do that in the second hour. We provide guidance and tools for the process. We'll also dive a little bit deeper into the victim archetype that is so prevalent in our culture, and how to transform the shadow victim into the enlightened victim, and how the victim archetype can show up in more subtle forms you may not be aware of, even within yourself. And we take another layer into that even deeper. We look at this drama triangle now also from an esoteric occult perspective in light of the hyperdimensional matrix, and how non-physical forces really that have been influencing humanity for eons benefit from us staying stuck in this drama triangle, since they feed on the emotional luge we project on each other. Again, if you're not a member yet, go to my website, veilofreality.com/membership, sign up there, and we'll be right back. Thank you for listening.